Hey everyone, so we're now going to move on to the next theory that we're covering in the course, so neoliberal institutionalism. There's some elements of similarity with liberalism, which is certainly suggested by the name, but there's actually a lot of similarities and overlaps with neorealism. So try to pay attention to how it's similar to neorealism, how it's different, how it's similar to liberalism, and how it's different. All right, so neoliberal institutionalism focuses a lot on interdependence. And so, again, kind of that linkage back into liberalism. So remember liberalism's third assumption: the configuration of interdependent state preferences determines state behavior, right? And neoliberalism focuses heavily on this interdependence. So what are the effects of interdependence on interstate action, on how states behave? So each state seeks to realize its distinctive preferences under varying constraints imposed by the preferences of other states. And patterns of preferences can be harmonious, conflictual, and cooperative. So we're going to be looking at what happens when, what happens in terms of state behavior when different states have harmonious, conflictual, or cooperative patterns of preferences. So neoliberal institutionalism is focused largely on how to achieve cooperation in an interdependent world, right? So given that in many, many different areas, we see interdependence, right? So the ability of states to achieve what they want depends on what other states want, the preferences of other states as well. So given that in many, many, many different areas, and this is part of where neoliberal institutionalism came in, was critiquing neorealism, saying you're not talking about interdependence enough, but in so many of the different areas, particularly outside of security, but even within security, but largely kind of they rose looking at international economics, particularly within international economics, and other areas too, like environment. In so many of these areas, just talked about independence, right? Like states pursuing their own policies, kind of, and it doesn't matter what other states or preferences are, it just doesn't really make much sense. And so neoliberal institutionalism emerged to see how do we achieve cooperation in an interdependent world. So what exactly does interdependence mean? So just going a little bit deeper on what interdependence means. So like anarchy, interdependence is a structural feature of the international system. So it feeds into when we talk about what is the international structure. Interdependence, like anarchy, so we've talked about you could have an anarchic structure, anarchy can be an element. Well, interdependence can also be an element of the international structure. Strategic interdependence, so the ability of a state to reach its goals depends on the choice of another state. Actors face mutual costs from ending the relationship, right? So if you want to get something, right, your ability to get it depends on what others do. So, so that means that you need some form of, you need to hope either because it's in their own interest or because of some form of negotiation that the other state will do what you want. And if you end your relationship with the other state, because it'll impact your ability to get the thing that you want, not only will the other state face costs from you ending the relationship, but you'll also face costs yourself. So again, think about, say, a trading relationship, like a free trade relationship, right? And both sides want to kind of maximize their economy, right? Now, so the ability to maximize your economy depends not only on opening up your own borders to trade, but also the other side opening up their own borders to trade. And both sides could only really realize the full gains of free trade if both states take these actions, right? So if one state ends the relationship, either state could choose to do so. Yes, you're imposing costs on the other state, but you're also imposing costs on yourself. Now, interdependence is not the opposite of anarchy. So sometimes people have treated it as, okay, so, neorealism talks about the anarchic international system, and then neoliberal institutionalism is kind of moving away from anarchy because it's talking about interdependence, right? That's not the case. You can have states that are fully interdependent on each other and still live in a world where there's no central authority, right? So saying that there's interdependence or not interdependence isn't necessarily dependent on the level of hierarchy versus anarchy. Interdependence also does not mean that there's a harmony of interests or that power is unimportant, right? So just because states are interdependent, so the ability to get what you want depends on what others do, doesn't mean that you want the same thing. So again, right, the ability, again, say you want economic growth through free trade, right? You may say Canada wants this with the United States, for example, right? Just because Canada's ability to achieve this goal depends also not only on what Canada does, but on what the US does. That doesn't imply that the US wants the same thing, right? It doesn't mean, now, if the US doesn't want the same thing, now possibly Canada can reach an agreement with the US where, by giving some concession, where the US will adopt the policy Canada wants. Again, that's not the same thing as a harmony of interest. It's not one and the same thing, but it's reaching some form of agreement. Or it's possible that the US will just never want it, in which case Canada won't be able to reach its goal. Also, power. It doesn't mean power is unimportant, right? So, for example, again, in the scenario where Canada wants something and the US doesn't, right? If Canada's got sufficient power, it can convince or coerce the US into adopting the position that it prefers, right? So it doesn't mean that power. There's also sometimes when we're talking about independence, there's multiple possible solutions to a given problem, right? So say there's a given problem and two states would like to reach a cooperative agreement so that they can both do better than what they're doing without cooperation. There's multiple cooperative solutions that can be reached, right? Some that country A would like better, some that country B would like better. Which of those agreements are reached may depend on who has more power between the different states. So saying that there's interdependence doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's in agreement and that power goes away. Interdependence means that actors are linked. While states remain sovereign, their actions are conditioned by the behavior of others. So at the end of the day, each state still has control over what they're going to do, right? So Canada gets to decide, Canada's still sovereign. Canada gets to decide what policy Canada's going to enact. The US is sovereign. The US gets to decide what policies it's going to enact. Mexico is sovereign. Mexico gets to decide what policies Mexico is going to enact. But it means that the choice of policy isn't only based on domestic politics, right? Yes, those domestic politics matter through all the things that liberalism talks about, like so the competition, you know, the commercial, ideational, and Republican side. So what are the preferences of the states, right? Those domestic processes that produce the preferences, yes, they matter. But based on the preferences of a state, the policies that will get chosen to best represent those preferences or the best achieve those preferences are conditioned by what other states do. Because depending on what other states do, your response, your ability to achieve those may be affected. So neoliberal institutionalism is a theory that based on the premise that interdependence is a fact in many situations in international politics. Neoliberal institutionalism was a theory created in the late 1970s, but probably best represented or most commonly associated with a book by Robert Cohen in 1984. Neoliberal institutionalism was a theory designed to address this. So it shares many of the same assumptions as neorealism, right? So the structure of the international system is anarchic, right? So anarchy is still a fact of life. States are rational unitary actors pursuing their self-interest, right? So while neoliberal institutionalism accepts that states can, unlike realism, which just assumes everybody is pursuing security, neoliberal institutionalism allows states to pursue any number of different preferences, but it doesn't care how those preferences are achieved, right? It doesn't look at the process of how those preferences are selected, right? It says it allows all those things to come forward, and then it says, okay, at the end of the day, Canada's chosen this, right? And then based on that assumption, it assumes that the entirety of the Canadian foreign policy apparatus will be pursuing that goal and will be doing so rationally. And the system is characterized by self-help, right? So it doesn't, again, bring in that states aren't have to take care of themselves. They're not interacting with each other out of the goodness of their hearts or because they necessarily want to help each other. All of this is based on the concept of you're trying to protect yourself, you're trying to enhance your own national interest, including survival and security. So it doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden altruistically trying to help others, right? You're still looking out for number one, but looking out for number one sometimes means having to interact with others because looking out for number one, your ability to do so is impacted by others. So here's some of the places where neoliberal institutionalism so shares many of the same premises, but some of the conclusions reached end up being different. So unlike realism, discord or conflict, remember in neorealism we said self-help and anarchy leads to conflictual or competitive foreign policies, right? Discord doesn't necessarily follow from egoism. Egoism is just another word for pursuing your self-interest. So pursuing your self-interest under anarchy doesn't necessarily mean conflict or competition is inevitable. When mutual interest is low, liberal institutionalism resembles neoliberalism, right? So when there's very little overlapping interests, right? Everything, there's complete disagreement over policy, right? So Canada really wants free trade, US has no interest in free trade, and there's no middle ground, right? Then liberal institutionalism resembles neorealism, right? So there's almost no differentiation between the two theories. However, when there's areas of common interest, cooperation is possible. And so that ends up being kind of the big dividing areas depending on the level of mutual interest, right? So if there's harmony, well then everybody's going to be pursuing, and we'll get into this in a second, if everybody just agrees, then there's no problem. Everybody will be doing what the other one wants without any even discussion. If there's no agreement whatsoever and no possibility of agreement because interests are just completely opposed, well then it's going to look a lot like the neo-realist world. You're going to have competitive policies, power is going to come into play in terms of who gets what they want, and it'll be a conflictual world. But there's areas in between both of those, right, where there's some level of overlap, not a perfect overlap, but there's some areas where they could possibly improve their outcomes, neither side's getting the best that they could do, and if they work together, they could both improve their situation, where there is some level of common interest. And this is the area where neoliberal institutionalism really comes in. It's looking at how can we get to this cooperation. And we get there partially through the use of international regimes. So international regimes are sets of rules, norms, and procedures around which expectations of actors converge on a certain issue. The convergence of expectations means that participants each expect to play by the same rules, right? So regimes aren't necessarily formal organizations. It could just be an area, a particular issue area. So one regime we talk about is, for example, often is the nuclear weapons regime along proliferation, right? So there's a whole set of rules, norms, and procedures, organizations, all on this particular issue that leads to an expectation of actors to converge on a certain issue. And because expectations converge, because of these rules and the belief that others are going to be following these same set of rules or procedures in this area, there's a set of stable expectations that each actor feels like they're going to be playing by the same rules. So it's not like sometimes without a regime, one country feels like they're playing by one set of rules and they believe another country is playing by a different set of rules. So it can be really hard to predict what's going to happen, but also to reach agreements, where if everybody's kind of playing by the same rule book, have the same set of understanding about how behavior is supposed to operate, then we can kind of reach patterned, stable behavior. So international politics frequently involves situations of political market failure. And so this is based on kind of the economics literature on market failure. And really what it means is the self-interest behavior of individual actors fails to produce a mutually beneficial outcome. So it typically, in this case, from the economics example, we'd be looking at, say, the market, right? And typically when we talk about the market, classical economics or liberal economics points to kind of like the Adam Smith notion that everybody acting in their own individual self-interest produces the optimal market, right? It's the best collectively. But there's certain situations where it's been found that if everybody acts in their own individual self-interest, we actually don't achieve the best outcome, right? People could actually achieve better outcomes or more mutually beneficial outcomes, right? If they didn't just go in their own individual self-interested behavior. And so some of these that we see in economics, but also in politics, sometimes center around like public good provision, right? So for example, if everybody pursues their own selfish self-interest, right? We end up with no roads, we end up with no schools, we end up with no healthcare, right? Because it's in nobody's real interest to build roads, right? Roads are things that once they're built, everybody gets to share, right? And unless you have tolls on them, you're not getting much economic benefit. So why would you pay to build it if everybody gets to reap the benefit from it, right? What you really need is everybody to contribute towards paying for it because everybody's deriving some benefit, and so the costs are split across it. But if everybody's acting in their own self-interest, individual self-interest, well, what's better for me that I'm better off if I don't pay for it, right? The best situation for me is everybody else pays for the road, I don't pay for the road, and I still get to use the road, right? So I get the benefit of the road at no cost. But if everybody looks at the scenario in the exact same way, then nobody contributes to building the road. Nobody pays the cost of it, but nobody gets the benefits of it. So in this situation, I see everybody is better off, collectively better off. We end up with a better outcome if we don't pursue our own individual self-interest. Because if everybody pursues their own individual self-interest, there's no road. That's the outcome, and that's not optimal. We're actually all better off if we pay a small cost. Everybody contributes to building the road, and we all get the benefit of it. But that's not in your individual rational self-interest. So those are situations of political market failure. And this is where neoliberal institutionalism is looking, how can we try to solve political market failure? So international regimes help to solve political market failure by reducing transaction costs and providing information. Cheating becomes more costly. If we're able to deal with each other, communicate with each other, so reduce transaction costs and provide information, then we're able to reach agreements. So part of the problem that occurs, again, let's go back to our road example, right? So, okay, so we all sit down and we reach an agreement. Everybody's going to contribute a certain amount towards the road. Well, what ends up happening? I might say I'm going to contribute towards it, but at the end of the day, I don't. And I let everybody else put their money into the pile, and it's still enough it may be a little bit less than we wanted for the road, but we could still squeeze it out, and I still get to use the road, right? So cheating's always the fear in these cases, again, because if I can sit it out, if I can what we refer to as free ride on the efforts of everybody else, I do better. So cheating, defecting from any agreement is always a fear that holds back cooperation on things like building roads, providing defense, any social good. So cheating, but if we have information, if we have a regime that collects information or creates certain norms of behavior, that provides information about what others are doing, right? If the second I try not to pay everybody else who's contributing finds out about it, they can punish me for not doing so, right? Because I've got information. If we're in a scenario where I could contribute and I could not contribute and nobody would know I didn't do it, well, then we're in a problem. If everybody knows, then they can punish me. So international regimes help by making cheating more costly. So when do regimes help us to avoid market failure? So when, in what scenarios? So I've talked about some providing public goods like a road. But that's just, one example. We'd like to have kind of more general rules about when we expect that political market failure, where individual self-interested behavior doesn't lead to collectively optimal. We refer to them as one of the terms used is Pareto suboptimal outcomes. So outcomes that are not in the collective self-interest, where we could do better by working together. All right, so before we can look at these kind of general scenarios, we often use games to kind of model and show these different scenarios. And so just want to talk through kind of some of these games with you, but first we've got to get down the language of these games. So, and we're going to be using, for the most part, 2-player games. Not that international politics is typically just 2 players, but it's more simple. And then you could scale them up, but for our purposes, it's easier just to look at 2. So imagine actor A and B. So it could be 2 people, 2 countries, 2 organizations who are interacting with each other. Both are rational actors. Both have a choice whether to cooperate or defect. So we're also simplifying it down to there's cooperation. You can choose to cooperate or defect. There's no, multiple forms of cooperation. There's no multiple forms of defection. You have choice between whether to cooperate or defect. So if you have 2 actors with 2 choices, you have 4 possible outcomes. A cooperates and B cooperates, and we represent this as CC for cooperate, cooperate. A defects and B cooperates, and we represent that as DC for defect, cooperate. A cooperates and B defects, we represent that as CD for cooperates, defects. So we always represent in the CC, DC, CD, we always represent A first and B second, just for simplicity. And then finally, we have A defects and B defects, which are represented as DD for defect, defect. Yeah, so we always list A first and B second. So CD would represent cooperate, defect for A cooperates, B defects. And when we're going through different games, you can pause to go back to the slide, or pause the video, return to the slide in your PowerPoint. If we're doing one of the games and you get a little bit confused, absolutely return to it. So both A and B have ordered preferences for these outcomes, right? For all of these 4 of these different situations. So there's 4 possible outcomes, and A and B each have kind of an ordering for how they like this. For example, imagine that A's preferences are cooperate, cooperate. So that's the favored position is cooperate, cooperate. Second favorite is cooperate, defect. Third favorite is defect, defect. And fourth favorite is defect, cooperate. And then B's preferences are cooperate, 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 defect, defect, cooperate, and defect, defect. And then preferred outcomes have higher numbers. This isn't, you do have to be careful if you read stuff using game theory. This next part isn't universal. So the examples I'm using, we put higher outcomes have higher numbers. You'll sometimes see examples where lower numbers are actually the preferred outcomes. So you've got to be a little bit careful here, but in all the examples I'm going to use, preferred outcomes have higher numbers. So again, there's 4 possible outcomes. So 4 is the best outcome, 3 is the second best, 2 is the third best, 1 is the worst outcome. All right, I'm just going to quickly turn on kind of the annotations just so I can be pointing a little bit. All right. So here's a representation of a possible game that you can have, right? So we have actor A here and actor B here, right? So actor A again has the choice between cooperate and defect, represented again as CD, and actor B has the same choices between cooperate and defect. And so this leads to 4 possible outcomes, right? Cooperate, 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 defect, defect, cooperate, and defect, defect, right? So going along here is any outcome where A defects. Going along here is any outcome where A cooperates. Going along here is any are outcomes where B cooperates, and going along here are outcomes where B defects, right? And again, we always represent A's preferences first and B's preferences second. So for example, in this example, A gets its best outcome. So if we just look at A's preferences, right? A's favorite is cooperate, cooperate. Second favorite is cooperate, defect. Third favorite is defect, defect. Fourth favorite, or least favorite, is defect, cooperate. When looking at B, B's favorite is cooperate, cooperate. Second favorite is defect, cooperate. Third favorite is cooperate, defect. And then least favorite is defect, defect. So how we usually play this in class is I get 2 volunteers for each different game that we go through, and each of them I assign one to be actor A, one to be actor B, and you know, simultaneously they say what their choice would be, and we see what the outcome is, and then they explain how they made their decision. That's a little bit difficult in this scenario. We've recorded even live in Zoom. We could try a couple of them if you want to try when we do kind of the joint meetings, review of theories, but even it'd be a little bit more difficult. But with each of these games, I'd like you to kind of think of yourself as actor A and think through, what would I choose? And if I were actor B, go through and say, what would I choose? Based on, remember, these are all interdependent situations. Your outcome doesn't only depend on what you do. So if you're actor A, you can choose to cooperate. That is within your choice. But you can't, the outcome depends on then whether B cooperates or defects. So you can choose that it could be one of, one of these 2 outcomes, right? But you can't choose which of these 2 outcomes. That's in B's choice. Same thing, if B chooses that B wants to cooperate, it can say the outcome will be one of these 2, but it's dependent on what A chooses as to which of these 2 outcomes it'll be. So always when you're thinking through, you've got to be thinking about what are, you know, not just what is my favorite, but also what are B's favorite? What is B likely to do based on my preferences? And also bearing in mind, so everybody's, you don't only want to be looking at your own preferences, you want to be looking at the others. So always before we advance and I explain the situation more, or kind of give the kind of title to the game, think through what you would do. So right now, think, if you're actor A, what would you choose to do here? Would you choose to cooperate or defect? If you're actor B, what would you choose to do? Cooperate or defect? All right, pause it if you're still thinking, because I'm about to move forward. All right, so this is an example of a harmony situation. Need to sort of bring the spotlight back up. Okay, so this is an example of a harmony situation. So most of you, hopefully, in whether you're actor A or actor B, in this case, chose to cooperate, right? Because let's look through the different possibilities. What does A prefer? What is A's favorite choices, right? Well, if B cooperates, does A prefer cooperate or defect? Well, A prefers to cooperate, right? 4 is better than 1. What if B defects? What does A prefer? Well, A prefers cooperate to defect. So no matter what B does, A prefers to cooperate. And if you go through actor B's preferences, you'll see the exact same thing, right? You'll see that B prefers to cooperate to defect, right? So it doesn't really matter. Both are going to choose to cooperate no matter what the other one does, right? You don't need any discussions. Even if they're choosing independently, both would choose to cooperate. No interventions needed, no discussions needed. Everybody just acting independently in their own self-interest is going to come to the best outcome. No market failure here. No need to have a regime here. Everything's looking pretty good. All right, here's another scenario. Again, actor A, actor B. Take a look at these different options and think through. First, put yourself as A, what would you choose? And put yourself as B, what would you choose? All right, just going to advance it. All right, so probably most of you, hopefully most of you, in either scenario chose defect, right? So let's look through kind of how you could be coming into this decision. So let's put yourself again as actor A, and let's look at, say actor B chooses to cooperate, right? What do you prefer to do? Well, you prefer the defect, right? Your best outcome here, this is your best outcome overall. You're hoping B is going to cooperate, right? You get your best outcome. What if the actor B chooses to defect? Well, you're going to choose to, you'd prefer to be defecting as well. You get a better outcome if you defect as well. And if you look at the scenario, it's the same thing in reverse. If you do go through it for actor B, you're getting the same different scenario, right? So in this case, no matter what the other one does, both actors prefer to defect. Now, they might like to sucker the other one into cooperating because they get the best outcome if the other one cooperates when they defect, but the best possible outcome for both of them is to defect. And so no level of providing information, preventing cheating, no level of discussion is ever going to push the other, either side to wanting to cooperate, to change their behavior to cooperate, because neither wants that, right? Both does better off by defecting. So nothing's going to push them towards cooperating. This is referred to as a situation of deadlock or pure conflict. So international regimes, when are they needed? International, when there's harmony or pure conflict, regimes are not needed. When there's harmony, they're not needed because just based on individual self-interest, they're already cooperating. And pure conflict or deadlock, they're not needed because no level of discussion, they'll both pretty much agree, we don't want to cooperate. Neither of them wants to cooperate based on the situation. Both does better off by defecting. So no regime's going to have, nothing's going to really be able, other than change in preferences, nothing's going to be able to push them towards cooperation. So where are regimes needed? Regimes are needed to solve what are referred to as dilemmas of common interest and dilemmas of common aversion. So we're going to look at examples of both of those now. All right, so this is the first scenario. And I'll give the name after. And so think through what you'd like to do if you're actor A and actor B. But just to help out a little bit, because this is maybe looking a little bit more complex, I'm going to give you a scenario for this, a scenario related to kind of the name for it. So think about, so you and your partner, so think you could be actor A, and because this is symmetrical, so it doesn't really matter whether you're actor A or actor B. Your decision should be the same. So you and actor B, you're both criminals, right? And you say just rob the bank, and you were arrested. You weren't caught on the scene, right? But you were after, the next day, police come and they arrest both of you on suspicion of, or at least bring you in question on suspicion for participating in the robbery, right? And they lock you and your partner, so actor A and actor B, both get locked in interview rooms separately, right? So you have no chance to discuss any options with your partner, right? You know that your partner's brought in. You know that they're being presented with options about whether they want to talk to the police or not talk to the police, take a deal, not take a deal. Their partner knows that you've been brought in, but you have no ability to communicate and strategize on what you want to do. So you both having to make your decisions independently. And so here's the scenario that's presented by the police. They don't have enough to convict based on the evidence they have. So they're hoping for some cooperation. So, but this is a big profile case, so they really want to close it. They really want to get the arrest, or at least get somebody, right? So first scenario, so because they don't have enough evidence, if both of you stay quiet, and stay quiet in criminal world is cooperating, right? You're cooperating with your partner. So if both of you cooperate with your partner and stay quiet, don't talk to the police, they have to release you. They don't have enough. So you both go free. If you rat on your partner, if you talk to the police, if you sing, so to speak, and your partner stays quiet, well, all they really care about is getting one conviction. But it's really good for the career of the police or the district attorney or the prosecutor to get this case solved and get a conviction, right? So they'll actually not only release you, but they'll give you a bonus for maybe a monetary outcome or some protection. They'll drop a charge, another pending charge they might have had on you for something else. So they'll actually give you a bonus for talking. But now for the person who stays quiet, the entire crime is now being pinned on them. So they're getting a big, and it's enough to convict now because you've got a cooperating witness. So they're going to a prison for a long time. They're getting the entirety of the term, right? If both of you are going to prison, maybe the term would have been smaller because it's split between you, but the prosecutor is going hard on this one person. And this could be the maximum conviction because they've got all the details. Then, and again, because it's symmetrical, if you stay quiet, right, you don't cooperate with the police. So you cooperate with, you cooperate with your fellow criminal, but he defects from being a good partner. You cooperate with your partner, but he or she defects, right? And he sings to the police, or he or she sings to the police. Well, he goes free and gets a nice bonus, and you're getting the full prison sentence. And then finally, if both of you defect, right, from the arrangement, or from cooperating with the partner. So both of you defect from being a good partner, and both of you sing to the police. Well, now they've got enough to convict both of you. So there's no deal because both of you sang. So it was always contingent on being getting kind of the release, getting the perk was always contingent on just one of you stayed quiet and the other talking to police. So in this case, both of you get convicted, right? They've got evidence against both of you, but you get a small prison sentence, right? Because it's split across, the prosecutor doesn't go as hard on either one of you. It's just happy to get two convictions, right? So in this case, maybe you get 5 years in jail, where in this case, you get maybe 10 years in jail. So go through again here, both stay silent. Nobody, you both cooperate with the partner and stay silent. Great outcome. You go free. In this scenario, let's go here. In both cases here, both of you defect from being a good partner. Both of you speak to the police. You both get 5 years in jail. Here, you're a bad partner, so you defect from the partnership, but your partner cooperates, is a good partner. So because you speak to the police and he or she doesn't, you get the nice benefit. So the 4, they get the long prison sentence, the 10 years. And here, you're a good partner. You cooperate with your partner, but they defect from the partnership. They're a bad partner. They go free. They get the bonus. You get the terrible sentence. So what do you do here? Think through, figure out what you would do here. And this game has been simulated thousands of times across different groups to see what people would do. And do people behave rationally? Because there is something clear to do rationally here. So pause it while you're thinking, and then move forward when you're ready. So this game is referred to as prisoner's dilemma. And there's a clear outcome that you should, if people are acting rationally, there's called what's an equilibrium outcome. If everybody's acting rationally, we end up at defect. And why do we get there? So let's go through again actor A, right? And so let's assume actor B cooperates. What do you prefer to do if actor B cooperates? Sorry, it's B1 and B2 and A1 and A2. It should be cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect. So if actor B cooperates and you're actor A, which outcome do you prefer? Well, you prefer to defect. And what if B defects? What do you prefer? Well, you prefer to defect, right? In either case. But let's look at this defect. Can you do better than that? Could you collectively do better than that? Is this the best possible allocation of joint resources or joint outcomes? No. You both do better off if you cooperate, right? Second best outcome versus third best outcome for both of you. You'd both be better off at cooperate than defect. But if you're acting in your own individual self-interest, you always end up at defect. So the question here becomes, this is where, again, regimes can come in, and this is where neoliberal institutionalism starts looking at, how can we get, if everybody's, this is a situation where we have a political market failure. People acting in their own individual self-interest end up at a suboptimal outcome. We could, if we act in our own individual self-interest, we end up at an outcome where we could both do better. We'd prefer to be here, right? In this scenario, you're both in jail for 5 years. In this scenario, you both go free. This is hell of better. This is better. We want to be here. But how do we get here? Right? And again, this is where fear of cheating comes in, right? Because I could sit across from you and say, again, imagine we were able to communicate. Or if you're just thinking about what the other one is going to do, right? But again, let's go with a scenario where we could communicate before. I could tell you, I could promise you, I could swear on, you know, a beloved family member that, or swear to a deity, swear to God that I'm going to cooperate, right? But how does the person know I'm not just saying that to try to goad them in, right? Because what's better than me than cooperating, both of us cooperating, what's better to me is I sucker them into cooperating and I defect, right? My best outcome is over here. And same thing, right? How do I know if my partner's saying all the right things about, oh, I'm going to cooperate? How do I know they're actually going to do that? Or they're not just saying that so that they could goad me into cooperating and then they're going to go get their best outcome where I get the worst, right? In both cases, I fear the other side has a legitimate reason to fear the other is going to cheat. So these type of scenarios, and prisoner's dilemma is an example of it, are examples of dilemmas of common interest. And these dilemmas arise when independent decision-making leads to an equilibrium outcomes that are Pareto deficient, meaning outcomes in which all actors prefer another given outcome to the equilibrium outcome, right? So again, oh, sorry, way too far, sorry. Okay, so again, here, the equilibrium outcome. This is where we end up acting in self-interest. This is better. We don't end up here acting in self-interest. So we have a common interest to do better or to get something else. Pareto deficient outcomes in which all actors prefer another given outcome to the equilibrium outcome. We all prefer the cooperate one. We can agree on that. Prisoner's dilemma is a classic example, not the only one. So what do we need to do to escape this? Parties must collaborate together, and all regimes must specify strict patterns of behavior and ensure that no one cheats, right? So these, you need strong regimes, right? You need strong agreements, you need strong provision of information, because while we prefer cooperate, we're always going to be fearful that the other side is going to cheat on us, right? And if there's too strong of a fear, that the other side's going to cheat, any agreement will fall apart, because if I feel that the other one's going to cheat, I have to cheat too, or else I get the worst outcome, right? And vice versa. If the other side has any suspicion that I'm going to cheat, they need to cheat themselves. They need to defect themselves to avoid their worst possible outcome. So you need to have a very clear regime that specifies strict patterns of behavior that make sure that no one cheats, or at least if they plan to cheat, that so you want things like strong information about what the other one's going to do. So if the other side's going to be cheating, I know about it in advance, and I could adjust my behavior in accordance. Or things like strong punishment. If they cheat, I have a recourse where I can punish them. So yes, where I would still end up getting the worst outcome, but I could punish them in a way where I could recuperate some of that loss. So say it's an economic agreement where the other side cheats, and so I lose a bunch of money. Well, I could punish them and recuperate some of that money. So that's what you need to overcome this. Anything weaker, say a forum where we could just share ideas, talk can be cheap, and so that may not be enough. Here's another example. So this is one where I'll give you the scenario for this one. So usually in this scenario, I invite up one male student, one female student. It really could be two male or two female, but to go along with how the game's usually presented, do one male and one female student. And the students, once they're chosen and once they volunteered, come up, find out that they are now in a couple together. They're now in a relationship. The scenario is that tonight is date night. So, both of the students, tonight's date night, and so they're both going to be meeting up for a date. Unfortunately, one or both of them forgot their cell phone at home, or it's broken, or battery ran out. They won't be seeing each other during the day. They have no other way of communicating with each other, and they never settled on what they're going to be doing for the date. They had listed a couple of possible options, right? They got down to two options of watching a football game together or going to a movie together. But they never settled on it. And the football game they were going to be watching at home, the movie they were going to be watching at the movie theater. And so, they need to know where they're going to go. And so here's the preference. So actor A, whether male or female student, or male or female participant, right? Their preferred outcome, number one outcome, is that both of them go home or go to the bar. Let's say one's at a bar and one's at a movie theater. They go to the bar and they watch the movie together. Watch the football game together. Second favorite outcome, so they prefer the football game. Second favorite outcome is they both watch the movie together, right? It's not the activity that the person wants to be doing, but it's date night. They want to be doing something together. So even if it's not the preferred outcome, at least they're together. The worst outcome, well, these are such romantics that even the student who prefers, or the person who prefers the movie, is just so distraught if they're if they're alone at the movie. And same thing for even the student who prefers the football game. They're so distraught if they're alone that they get zero enjoyment out of other activity if they're alone. The night is ruined, right? So if they end up at different places, right? If one ends up at the movie, the other the football, or vice versa, or ends up at the football and the movie, they're both so distraught that they get no satisfaction out of the night. They have no ways to communicate on where they're going to go. So what do you choose? And this one ends up often being the most fun when we do it, to see what people choose, because it's really like flipping a coin. So it should be 50-50 odds, but what other assumptions do people smuggle in, say about who should get what they want, or personality of the student? So it could be a lot of fun. But just based on this, if we have no other information, right, it's pretty much a 50-50 odds that they end up together and getting at least an okay outcome, and 25% odds that they get their preferred outcome. So we refer to this game, this game is referred to as the Battle of the Sexes. And like I said, it's pretty much 50-50 odds that you get one of these two, 50-50 odds that you get one of these. And while both students, so yes, actor A prefers this one, actor B prefers this one. Really the more intense portion of this game is really what they both want to be doing is avoiding these two outcomes. And so we refer to these games as dilemmas of common aversion. So a dilemma of common aversion arises when actors with contingent strategies do not most prefer the same outcome, but do agree that there is at least one outcome that all want to avoid. So don't necessarily agree, right? Again, in this scenario, they don't agree on which activity they want to do, but they certainly agree that there's at least one outcome that they really, really, really want to avoid. Regimes intended to deal with dilemmas of common aversion need only facilitate coordination. So these are often simpler than regimes to establish, often require weaker setups, often not necessarily even say, dilemmas of common aversion, you may need to set up an entire organization, like a formal organization that has certain powers of, say, information gathering, has certain powers of punishment. Usually in this case, regimes of common aversion require much less stringent rules, right? Because all what you really need to do is get some way where they can communicate and reach an agreement. So again, it might be something less in, when it comes to, for example, airline procedures for flying internationally, right? Each country may have their own domestic rules for, could develop their own domestic rules for how airplanes communicate with air traffic control towers. And that would be fine if there was no international flights. But what happens if each country has their own domestic rules and then a plane flies into, a Canadian plane flies to the US and it doesn't know the procedures for air traffic control there? That could be chaotic. You also don't necessarily want the plane having to have a list of air traffic control procedures in each country. So what might be more useful? Some form of coordination in terms of these are the rules that are established for everyone. It doesn't necessarily matter what the rules are. It just matters that everybody follows them, right? It could be in terms of what language is used. It doesn't really matter what the language is, right? The pilots could learn whichever language it is, whether it's English or French or German or Mandarin or Arabic. It doesn't really matter. The pilots could learn the required procedures for doing it. What matters is that there's an agreed upon language so that you avoid accidents and you don't have plane crashes. That's what really matters. On a more domestic level, right? Some countries drive on the right, some countries drive on the left. At the end of the day, does it really matter whether it's right or left? No. What matters is that everybody agrees and understands what the rules are. Once it's decided it's right, you're going to have nobody who's going to be like, oh, I'm just going to drive on the left for the fun of it. You may have some great special individuals who might do so, but in general, and at the same time, if it ends up being on the left, right, some people may have preferred the right at the end of the day, they're all just going to fall in line. What we really just need is a rule. Once everybody knows the rule, they have no problem by abiding by it. We just need a way to establish the rule. We just need a way to coordinate and make sure that everyone's going to end up on the same date, or it's going to be speaking the same language, or it's going to be driving on the wrong side, because either with failure of coordination, people either end up on the wrong date and dissatisfied, we end up with plane crashes, we end up with car crashes, which are all outcomes that we really, really, really want to avoid. When looking at how you can get cooperation in many of these different games, it's important to understand how the structure affects the possibility for cooperation. In particular, if you can develop regimes or institutions that can help adjust the structure in certain ways, it may be easier to achieve cooperation. You can also understand when is it going to be more difficult to get cooperation, even if you think that people might want it. Why is it sometimes much more difficult to achieve? So how can structure affect the likelihood of cooperation? Well, first, if we just look at the payoffs, right? You'll notice when we look at some of the different games, that cooperation is easier to achieve in some games than in others, right? So, for example, in some games, if we look at the payoff structures in harmony situations, there's no cooperation needed whatsoever. The payoff structures are in such a way that people are automatically going to be doing, there's a harmony of interest, people are automatically going to be doing what the other one wanted anyways. Then in some situations in deadlock, there's no possibility for achieving cooperation. And then in other games, it'll vary based on the payoff structure, how easy it is to get cooperation. So for example, some games may be easier than others. Stag Hunt, typically we would think would be an easier game than Prisoner's Dilemma to get cooperation. In Stag Hunt, everyone has the incentive really to cooperate. It's just fear that somebody else will cheat. But there's little reason to think that anybody else wants to cheat, right? It just could be a communication problem, it could be a lack of trust problem, but everybody wants to actually cooperate and nobody has any incentive to defect from that. Prisoner's Dilemma, on the other hand, yes, people want to move from defect to cooperate, but there's always that worry that when you're even putting in place plans to move to cooperation, you know that the entire time you're cooperating that the other player has an incentive to defect, right? So that's a much more complicated game to achieve cooperation, even within Prisoner's Dilemma, right? Sometimes it'll be easier to achieve cooperation than others. So if the sucker's payoff is very high, it's very extreme, then it can be very difficult to achieve cooperation. If similarly, so if the cost of being the sucker is very high, but similarly, if the reward for affecting when the other person cooperates is very high, it can be very difficult to achieve cooperation. If the rewards of mutual cooperation is high, it can be easier to achieve cooperation. So the payoff structure is going to affect how easy it is to reach cooperation when there's a possibility, when the current situation is a market failure and there's an opportunity to cooperate. The payoff structure is going to affect how easy it is to translate that. The shadow of the future is also going to affect it. So shadow of the future means how much does the future weigh on current decisions. So for example, cooperation is influenced by long time horizons. So the more times you're going to be interacting with the same person, the easier it typically is to achieve cooperation. So for example, in a Prisoner's Dilemma type situation, if you're only playing with the person one time, then you have an incentive to just defect because you're not even worried about what the next one's going to do next time. Worst case scenario is that you end up at the second worst. Remember, in one play of Prisoner's Dilemma, no matter what the other one does, you're better off defecting, right? So even if you're going to end up in defect and cooperate will be better. Most of the time, you're probably still just going to risk going to defect and kind of hope for the best. If you're playing against the same person repeatedly, right? And if you know that if you defect one time, you're probably stuck in this pattern of they're not going to be trusting you, they're not going to be cooperating, and you're going to be getting probably defect the entire time, or possibly if you're trying to force them into cooperation, you may even cooperate and they defect, but they're not likely to be trusting you anytime soon. So if you're going to be repeating with them a lot, all of a sudden these losses of repeatedly staying in defect are going to probably be weighing on you a little bit, saying, maybe we do want to, we're sacrificing quite a bit being in defect. Maybe we should try to find ways that we can end up in cooperate, because we're losing a lot by not being there. Similarly, predictable stakes, right? So if you always understand what's on the line, you understand what the other person wants, you understand what you want. So it's a very similar game that you're repeating. Having regular stakes makes it predictable, makes it understandable what the other side wants. reliability of information about the others. So remember, many of these games, part of the problem in achieving cooperation is that there's problems in trusting the other side. So you're always fearful that they're going to be defecting, if we're talking about a prisoner's dilemma type game, and if you're worried that you're going to be just kind of not properly coordinating in kind of a chicken style game, right? Remember, the biggest thing you're trying to avoid in a chicken style game or in a battle of sexes game is one where you end up in the worst case outcomes, right? So in those type ones, having reliable information about what the other one's going to do is very important to achieving positive results. And then feedback about changes in others' behavior. So again, information is highly valuable in these types of games, whether it's a coordination or a collaboration type problem. In a coordination one, if the other one's going to be changing behavior, you want to make sure that you're changing your behavior accordingly. And if it's a collaboration type game, if the other side's going to be defecting, imagine you're in a scenario where you're trying to get to cooperate, and you could be told in advance that what the other side's going to be doing, right? So you could, and they're going to be told in advance of what you're doing. Imagine how easy it would be to achieve cooperation, right? If they knew in advance that you were going to cheat, right? So if you were going to cheat in advance, they'd be able to adjust. And if you were going to, and vice versa, right? Then your choices really, each round would be between defect, and cooperate. Right? If you're in a prisoner's dilemma, if your choices are between defect, and cooperate, it's a pretty darn easy game to solve. And it turns out, in terms of Shadow of the Future, so they've actually simulated in the 1980s. They had, for prisoner's dilemma, they had a computer. They had a tournament where people could submit different strategies for playing repeated prisoner's dilemma to see what was most successful. And there was all kinds of different strategies. And the one that actually won was tit for tat, the one that matching up against different strategies typically performed the best in simulations was a tit for tat strategy. And simply tit for tat is you start by cooperating, and then you do whatever the other person does in the previous round. So if they defect, you defect in the next round. If they cooperate, you cooperate, right? So you start with cooperation. If they defect, you punish them, but it's not such a long punishment that you can never get back on track. If they then adjust to that punishment and start cooperating, then you can go back and start cooperating as well. So it punishes defection, but not in such a way that it punishes it for so long that you can never get back on track. And then finally, number of actors is an important problem. So with many of these games that are very challenging to solve just with two people, it becomes infinitely more difficult to resolve with multiple people. And that's a problem in international politics when we often have multiple actors. So often it's in terms of a sanctioning problem, right? So it's more difficult to gain accurate information about multiple actors, but also to be able to punish defection by multiple actors. So imagine you're trying to get to cooperation. And the way you're trying to do so is by having an enforcement where you're going to punish somebody if they don't cooperate. Right. So if they're going to defect, there's some mechanism put in place whereby there's a predictable punishment that will come on them. The more people there are, the more difficult it is to monitor to see how everyone's playing. Are they actually cooperating or defecting? Imagine an arms control agreement that has like 100 different members, right? You've got to be watching the arms production of 100 different members. But it's also more difficult to organize punishment, because it's not just punishment by one person, it's punishment probably by a lot of different people. And organizing that can be very difficult. So in terms of achieving solid information, which is necessary for cooperation, but also in terms of punishing defection, the larger number of players is much more difficult. Now let's turn to absolute versus relative gains. And this is a big debate that occurred in the late 1980s, early 1990s between neorealism and neoliberalism. So neoliberalism really started rise into prominence in the mid 1980s and late 1980s. And so there was this large battle between neorealism and neoliberalism. Because remember, they share some very similar perspectives, right? They have a lot of the same assumptions, but they differ in terms of what are the implications of these shared assumptions. And a big area of division, which leads to their diverging viewpoints, is about the difference between absolute and relative gains. So there's this long debate between neorealists and neoliberals about whether states pursue absolute or relative gains. So the neo-realist perspective on this is that when faced with the possibility of cooperating for mutual gains, states that feel insecure must ask how the gain will be divided. They're compelled to ask not will both of us gain, but who will gain more, right? So remember, in an environment where you care about your security, yes, you'd love it for everybody to be able to gain, but if somebody gains more than you, even if you both gain, but somebody gains more than you, they could turn those additional gains into something that makes you less secure, right? So if you get, say you make a trade deal with them and they get $10 billion out of it and you get $5 billion out of it, they could take that additional $5 billion and turn that into weaponry that could be used against you. So it hurts you in a relative, your relative power position vis-a-vis them, which hurts your security. So when security is always your number one gain, you're not only worried about will this agreement help us both, right? Which is obviously an important standard for reaching an agreement for cooperating, but also how am I going to gain relative to them? So you need to find, because both sides should be thinking this way, you need to find agreements where both gain equally. And so we're making the bar to cooperation has become that much more difficult, right? Not only does it have to be something that where gains are possible, which is already tough enough often, but it has to be kind of equal gains. So relative gains concerns makes neorealists much more pessimistic or skeptical of the likelihood of cooperation, just because of the relative gains concerns, because also the costs of defection are so high when your survival is at stake. It makes them think that cooperation will be very rare. The neoliberal perspective says that it's true. Under conditions of severe conflict, cooperation is more difficult, right? And so if there is severe conflict, states are probably more likely to behave in the relative gains type manner because they are fearful of what the other side's going to do. And it's already difficult enough to achieve cooperation. And it's true that on security issues, cooperation is more difficult to achieve than on, say, economic ones or social ones. Neorealists will retort that even if it's on non-security issues, for example, economic issues, additional gains in money can turn into weaponry, so it could be turned into security. And neorealists typically focus more on the security side. Neoliberals are focused more on the economic side. So there's some level of divide where neorealists say because at least any material cooperation on anything material can be translated into security, that cooperation is always difficult to achieve. Neoliberals make a little bit of a separation here. Security issues, yes, more difficult because there's a clear link to security. Economic and other issues, more easier to achieve. Neoliberalism examines how to improve prospects for cooperation when mutual interests exist. Because states from the neoliberal perspective aren't always caring about relative gains, particularly when there are harmony of interest, so there are overlapping interests between both sides. And when we're not dealing with profound security interests, neoliberalism then is focused on how can we get from this market failure into this area of cooperation. And so they argue that relative gains may be important motivating forces for states and firms, but only when gains in one period alter power relations in another, and when there is some likelihood that subsequent advantages in power may be used against oneself, right? So it has to be that the additional relative gains are something that's going to change the power landscape, and that there's some belief that even this change in power landscape is going to be something that is going to be hurting you in the future, right? If it's a state that isn't, threatening to you, or if the gain, say it's gains in like, through social cooperation, right? Where there's no material effect. It's not changing the power balance. Nothing can be used in the future. To, in that case, then relative gains aren't really a concern. And so states are just looking for, are we doing better? Is there absolute gains? Are we both winning? If we're both winning, this is great. All right, that's it for all. That's all for today. English is hard sometimes. I'll talk to you soon.